Mark's patrol car rolled slowly along the narrow road that cut behind the old industrial strip and into a stretch of quiet county land. The sun was low and pale, and the light made the bare branches look like thin bones against the sky. He had been a police officer long enough to know that the calls that sounded simple on the radio often held the most trouble in real life. The dispatcher had said a dog was tied to a tree near the woods, and the caller sounded upset, like they had seen something they could not ignore. Mark kept one hand on the wheel and listened to the wind pushing across the fields. Then he turned onto the gravel shoulder and parked. He stepped out and felt the cold bite at his cheeks. The air smelled like damp leaves and wet soil. Mark adjusted his jacket and started walking toward the tree line, following the directions from the caller. The woods were not deep, but the path into them was uneven, and it forced him to slow down. He heard a sound that was faint at first, like a small cry that kept stopping and starting. He moved carefully, scanning the ground for broken glass or anything sharp, because animals tied up in panic often pulled and thrashed until the area around them turned dangerous. When he pushed past a cluster of bushes, he saw the dog. A German shepherd stood near a thick oak tree. A rope was looped around the trunk and pulled tight to the dog's collar. The rope looked old and rough, like it had been used for yard work. The dog's fur was dirty and stuck together in places, and its chest rose and fell in a controlled rhythm that did not match a normal lost pet. Its eyes were bright and focused, watching Mark with a steady stare. It did not bark. It did not lunge. It simply stood there with its legs planted, like it had been told to stay. Mark stopped several feet away and lowered his voice. He spoke in the calm tone he used with frightened children and shaken adults, because fear was fear no matter who carried it. The dog did not relax, but it also did not panic. Its ears remained upright, its head slightly raised, its gaze moving from Mark's face to Mark's hands and back again. Mark took another step and noticed the circle of worn dirt around the tree. The ground was packed down and scuffed, as if the dog had paced the same route for hours. There were scratch marks near the roots, and bits of bark were scraped away from the trunk, showing how much pressure the rope had pulled against it. Mark crouched slowly and kept his body turned sideways, so he looked less threatening. He held his hands low and open. The dog's nose flared, and it sniffed the air, but it did not move closer. Mark could see the rope rubbing the collar, and he worried about how long the dog had been there. He pulled a small bottle of water from his belt bag, opened it, and poured a bit into the cap. He slid the cap across the dirt and waited. The dog watched the cap like it was a test. Then it took 2 careful steps forward, drank quickly, and stepped back into position. That moment told Mark something important. This was not a dog that had never been around people. This was a dog that understood rules. It drank like it was allowed to do so, not like it was desperate and out of control. Mark's mind ran through possibilities. A lost working dog. A dog stolen and dumped. A dog tied up by someone who did not want it anymore. Each idea felt wrong in a different way. As Mark studied the dog more closely, he noticed a small folded piece of fabric tucked under the edge of the collar. At first he thought it might be a torn bandage or a tag, but the fold looked deliberate. It was pressed flat, held in place by the collar buckle like someone wanted it hidden but not lost. Mark's heart beat a little faster, because hidden things usually meant a story that someone tried to bury. He shifted his weight slowly and spoke again, softer. He inched forward until he was close enough to reach the collar without crowding the dog. The German shepherd stayed still, muscles tight but controlled. Mark extended 2 fingers and touched the collar. The dog did not flinch. That alone made Mark pause, because most abandoned pets either leaned in to help or snapped from fear. This dog remained steady, as if it had learned patience the hard way. Mark carefully pulled the folded fabric free. The dog's eyes followed the movement, and the moment the cloth came loose, the dog released a low sound that was not a growl, but not calm either. It was a warning that carried emotion. Mark froze for a second, then held the cloth up where the dog could see it, like he was showing he would not take anything else. The dog's ears flicked, and it settled again. Mark unfolded the fabric in his hands. It was a patch. The colors were faded from weather and time, but the shape and stitching were clear. It was not a fashion patch. It was not a child's decoration. It was a unit emblem, the kind used on uniforms and gear. Mark recognized the design from a training event he had attended months ago with another county department. A search and rescue unit. Mark felt a cold heaviness settle in his stomach. He looked at the dog again, and now the posture made sense. The discipline made sense. The calm under stress made sense. This dog had training. It had purpose. It was not supposed to be here, tied to a tree like unwanted trash. Mark stood up slowly and reached for his radio. He kept his eyes on the dog while he spoke to dispatch. He gave the location. He described the dog. He mentioned the patch. He asked if there were any recent reports about missing working animals, or any rescue operations that ended badly. The radio hissed, then the dispatcher told him to hold and promised to check. While waiting, Mark walked back to his car and grabbed a leash and a soft blanket. He returned and approached with the leash in his hand, moving slowly. The dog watched him closely. Mark did not try to put the leash on right away. He sat on the ground a few feet away, placed the blanket near the dog, and waited. Minutes passed. The wind moved through the trees. The dog blinked, then lowered its head slightly, but it did not lie down. It did not sleep. It stayed on duty. The radio crackled again. Dispatch came back with a quiet voice that sounded different now. There had been a report weeks earlier about a search and rescue dog missing after a landslide response in the mountains. The operation had been chaotic. Several teams were involved. One handler never made it back. They searched for days but had to stop when the area became unsafe. The dog's name was Ranger. The report said Ranger was a German shepherd. Mark's throat tightened. He looked at the dog, and the dog stared right back, as if it understood the words through the tone alone. Mark did not know if this was Ranger for sure, but the odds felt too strong to ignore. He spoke the name softly, almost like a question. Ranger. The dog's ears lifted higher. Its body tensed. Then it took one step forward and stopped. Mark felt a surge of emotion that he pushed down, because he needed a clear head. He looked around the woods, suddenly aware that this place was too quiet. He noticed the trail behind the tree, narrow and half hidden by brush. It led deeper into the forest. The dog's gaze kept flicking toward that trail, then back to Mark, like it was waiting for something. Mark stood and moved closer to the rope. He examined the knot. It was tied tightly but not expertly, like someone had rushed. He loosened it a little to ease pressure, but he did not fully untie it yet. The dog did not pull away. It stayed close, but its attention was locked on the trail. Its breathing changed, not faster, but sharper, like it was ready to move. Mark followed the direction of the dog's stare and felt his skin prickle. The trail looked ordinary, but something about the dog's focus made it feel like a doorway into a hidden truth. Mark swallowed and made a careful choice. He clipped the leash to the collar, then untied the rope completely. He stepped back and gave the dog space. The German shepherd did not run. It did not bolt for freedom. It turned toward the trail, took a few steps, then stopped and looked back at Mark. The look was not fear. It was not begging. It was an instruction, clear and firm, like a trained partner asking him to follow. Mark tightened his grip on the leash and took a slow step forward. The dog moved again, guiding him down the trail and into the woods, as if the real reason it had stayed alive and alert all this time was not to be rescued, but to bring someone to what it had been guarding. The German shepherd moved ahead with steady steps, guiding Mark along the narrow trail that cut through the woods. The leash stayed loose, because the dog did not pull or rush. It walked with purpose, pausing now and then to make sure Mark was still behind it. The ground sloped gently downward, and the air grew cooler as tall trees blocked the fading sunlight. Mark stayed alert, watching his footing and listening to every sound, because the woods had a way of hiding danger in plain sight. As they moved deeper, Mark noticed signs that someone else had passed through this area before. Broken branches lay across the path, pressed down rather than fallen naturally. The soil was disturbed in places, showing marks that looked like heavy boots sliding on loose dirt. The dog slowed near these spots, sniffing carefully, then continued forward without hesitation. Mark realized the dog was not searching randomly. It already knew where it was going. The forest grew thicker, and the path narrowed until branches brushed against Mark's jacket. He felt the weight of the situation settle on his chest. This was no longer just about a dog tied to a tree. There was a story here, one that had been waiting in silence. The dog's ears twitched at distant sounds, but it did not change direction. Its focus stayed fixed ahead. After several minutes, the dog stopped suddenly. Its body stiffened, and it lowered its head slightly. Mark halted too, scanning the area. The ground here was uneven, covered in rocks and fallen leaves. A faint smell drifted through the air, not strong but noticeable enough to raise concern. Mark's instincts told him they were close to something important. The dog stepped off the path and moved toward a cluster of large rocks near a shallow dip in the ground. It sniffed the earth, then pawed gently at the leaves before stepping back and sitting down. Its posture was calm, almost formal, as if it had completed a task and was waiting for the next command. Mark's heart began to pound harder. He approached slowly and knelt near the spot the dog had marked. With careful hands, he brushed aside leaves and loose soil. Underneath, he saw the edge of a dark fabric strap. Mark's breath caught as he pulled gently, revealing a worn backpack partially buried in the dirt. The fabric was torn, and the zipper was cracked, but the bag was still intact. Mark paused for a moment, feeling the weight of what this could mean. He looked at the dog, and the German shepherd met his gaze steadily. There was no panic in its eyes. Only patience. Mark took a breath and opened the backpack. Inside were personal items. A water bottle that was empty. A folded map stained with mud. A flashlight with a cracked lens. Then Mark found an identification card tucked into a side pocket. It belonged to a rescue worker. The name was worn but readable. Mark felt a chill run through him as the truth began to settle in his mind. He reached for his radio with steady hands and called for backup. His voice stayed calm, but the weight behind his words was clear. He gave his location and explained what he had found. The dispatcher responded quickly, promising support and medical teams, though Mark already knew what they would likely discover. While waiting, Mark stayed near the spot, and the dog remained seated beside him. The forest was quiet, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Mark glanced at the dog again and noticed how still it was. It was not restless. It was not confused. It was like it had been waiting for someone to understand. Mark's thoughts drifted to the report dispatch had mentioned earlier. A landslide. A missing handler. A dog that never returned. The pieces were fitting together in a way that felt heavy and sad. He imagined the handler injured and struggling through the forest, with the dog staying close, guiding, guarding, refusing to leave. The sound of distant voices broke the silence as other officers arrived. Mark stood and waved them over, guiding them carefully to the spot. They secured the area and examined the backpack and the ground around it. Their faces grew serious as they recognized what they were seeing. The dog stayed close to Mark, watching the activity without fear. One officer approached slowly and spoke softly to it, but the dog did not move away from Mark's side. Mark placed a gentle hand on its back, and the dog leaned slightly into the touch, a small sign of trust that spoke louder than any sound. As more equipment arrived, the team began a careful search of the surrounding area. Not far from the backpack, they found signs that confirmed what Mark had feared. The handler had likely been injured during the landslide and managed to reach this spot before losing strength. The dog had stayed. It had guarded. It had waited. Mark felt a deep respect rise within him as he watched the German Shepherd. This animal had carried duty in its heart far beyond what anyone could ask. It had survived alone, tied up by someone who did not understand its purpose, yet it had never given up on protecting the truth. One of the officers asked Mark quietly how long the dog might have been there. Mark shook his head, unsure, but the worn ground and faded patch told a story of time passing slowly. Days. Weeks. Maybe longer. Through rain and cold nights, the dog had stayed alert, waiting for the right person to listen. As the search continued, Mark stayed with the dog, offering water and quiet reassurance. The German Shepherd accepted the care but never relaxed fully. Its eyes kept drifting back toward the place where the backpack had been found, as if it needed to see that its mission was finally understood. When the team finished their work, the mood was heavy but respectful. The handler would be honored. The truth would be known. Mark knelt beside the dog again and spoke softly, though he was not sure the words mattered. What mattered was that the dog was no longer alone in carrying the burden of what had happened. The German Shepherd shifted closer to Mark and sat at his side, no longer leading, no longer watching the trail. For the first time since Mark had found it tied to the tree, the dog allowed itself to rest, trusting that the story it had guarded so carefully was finally in safe hands. As daylight slowly faded, the officers completed their careful work and prepared to leave the forest. Mark stayed behind a little longer, standing near the German Shepherd while the others packed their equipment. The woods felt different now, no longer silent with mystery but heavy with truth. The dog sat close to Mark, its body relaxed in a way that showed a long-held tension was finally easing. Mark clipped the leash securely and guided the dog back toward the trail. The dog followed without hesitation, no longer leading the way but walking beside him as an equal. Every step away from the hidden spot felt like closing a chapter that had been left open for too long. The path back seemed shorter, as if the forest itself was letting them pass. When they reached the patrol car, Mark opened the back door and placed the blanket inside. The German Shepherd stepped in calmly and lay down, resting its head on its paws. Its eyes stayed open, watching Mark with quiet attention. Mark closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the moment settle. Back at the station, the news of the discovery spread quickly. Officers spoke in low voices, sharing details with respect. The rescue team was notified, and arrangements were made to honor the missing handler properly. Mark listened from a distance, his thoughts focused on the dog waiting in the vehicle outside. When he returned to the car, he let the dog out slowly. The German Shepherd stretched its legs and stood tall, looking around the parking lot with calm curiosity. It did not seem overwhelmed by the noise or movement. Years of training had prepared it for chaos, and even now, after everything it had endured, it carried itself with steady dignity. A veterinary officer arrived to examine the dog. They checked its paws, its joints, and its breathing. Despite signs of fatigue and time spent outdoors, the dog was in strong condition. The officer shook their head in disbelief and spoke quietly about how remarkable the dog was. Mark felt a surge of pride, even though the dog was not yet his. The dog was taken to a quiet room inside the station where it could rest. Mark stayed nearby, filling out reports and answering questions. Every so often, he glanced toward the door, making sure the dog was still there. Each time he checked, the dog was lying calmly, eyes half closed, finally allowing rest to come. Later that evening, Mark sat on a bench outside the room, replaying everything in his mind. He thought about the handler who had trusted this dog with their life. He thought about the long days and nights the dog must have waited, tied to a tree, still holding on to duty. The loyalty was overwhelming. A senior officer joined Mark and sat beside him. They spoke quietly about the case, about how not everyone would understand what the dog had done. Mark knew that some people would see only an animal, not a partner. But Mark had seen enough to know the truth. When Mark stood and entered the room again, the German Shepherd lifted its head and looked straight at him. Its eyes were calm and clear, no longer carrying urgency or fear. Mark knelt and placed a gentle hand on its shoulder. The dog leaned into the touch, a small but powerful gesture of trust. Mark spoke softly, telling the dog it was safe now. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was deep. The dog did not react strongly, but its breathing slowed, and its eyes closed for a moment. That moment told Mark more than any report ever could. As the night grew late, arrangements were made for the dog to stay overnight under care. Mark volunteered to check in during his shift and again in the morning. He did not feel like leaving, but he knew rest was needed for both of them. Before leaving, Mark returned one last time. The German Shepherd opened its eyes and watched him approach. Mark paused, feeling a quiet connection that did not need words. He promised himself that he would not let the dog be forgotten or passed aside once the paperwork ended. Outside, the night air was cool and still. Mark walked to his car slowly, feeling changed by the day. He had answered a simple call about a tied dog and uncovered a story of loyalty and loss that would stay with him forever. As he drove home, Mark knew the case was not truly over. There were decisions ahead about the dog's future. There were reports to finish and conversations to have. But one thing was already clear in his heart. The German Shepherd had completed its duty with honor. Now it was time for someone else to carry responsibility for it. Mark felt that responsibility settling into place, quiet but firm, just like the dog itself. Some bonds form not through words or time but through shared understanding. Mark knew that whatever happened next, his life and the life of that loyal dog were now connected by a story neither of them would ever forget. Morning light slipped through the windows of the station, soft and pale, bringing a sense of calm after the long night. Mark arrived early, carrying a small bag with food and a clean towel. His steps slowed as he reached the quiet room where the German Shepherd rested. When he opened the door, the dog lifted its head and looked at him with steady eyes, alert but no longer burdened. Mark knelt beside the dog and greeted it in a low voice. The dog stood and stretched, then stepped closer, pressing its shoulder lightly against him. That small action carried trust and relief, as if the dog understood that its waiting was finally over. Mark felt something tighten in his chest, not sadness, but respect. The veterinary officer returned to complete the final checks. The dog was cleared with notes of mild exhaustion and signs of long-term exposure, but nothing serious. Everyone agreed the dog was strong and resilient. The question of what would happen next hung quietly in the room. Later that day, members of the rescue unit arrived. They recognized the patch immediately. They spoke of the handler with care and honor, sharing memories of training days and difficult missions. When they looked at the dog, their voices softened. This dog had been more than a tool. It had been a partner. The German Shepherd listened calmly as they spoke, sitting near Mark. It did not react to the unfamiliar voices or movements. It simply stayed where it felt safe. One of the rescue members knelt and thanked the dog quietly. The dog leaned forward and touched the ground with its nose, then returned to sitting. The moment was quiet but powerful. The rescue unit explained that the dog had earned retirement. It had completed its service beyond expectation. There would be no more missions. No more long nights in harsh places. It deserved peace. Mark listened carefully, already knowing what he wanted, but waiting for the right time to speak. When the conversation paused, Mark stepped forward. He explained how the dog had led him, how it had waited, how it had trusted him. He said he would be honored to give the dog a home if it was allowed. The room fell silent for a moment, then nods followed. The decision felt right to everyone there. Paperwork took time, but Mark stayed patient. He sat on the floor with the dog while forms were signed and calls were made. The dog rested beside him, its head near his knee. For the first time since they met, the dog slept deeply, breathing slow and even. When everything was finished, Mark clipped on a new collar, simple and strong. He opened the door and walked outside with the dog beside him. The sky was bright, and the air felt lighter. As they reached the car, the dog paused, looking around the lot one last time. Then it stepped forward and jumped in without hesitation. At Mark's home, the dog explored quietly. It moved from room to room, sniffing corners and listening to sounds. It did not rush or act nervous. It seemed to understand that this place was different. When it finished exploring, it returned to Mark and sat near the door, watching the outside world through the window. Over the next days, a routine formed. Morning walks were calm and steady. The dog stayed close, matching Mark's pace. Neighbors noticed and smiled, sensing the bond without knowing the story. At night, the dog rested near the front door or beside the couch, always aware but finally at ease. Mark learned small things about the dog. It liked quiet music. It preferred cool water. It watched shadows move across the floor with interest but never alarm. Sometimes, during walks near wooded areas, it paused and listened, then continued without pulling or tension. The past no longer controlled it. One evening, Mark sat on the porch as the sun set. The dog lay at his feet, head resting on its paws. The world felt steady. Mark thought about how close the dog had come to being forgotten, tied to a tree with a story no one knew. He felt grateful that he had been the one to stop and listen. The rescue unit later held a small ceremony to honor the handler. Mark attended with the dog at his side. When the name was spoken, the dog lifted its head and stood tall. It stayed still, focused, respectful. When the moment passed, it sat again, calm and present. Life moved forward, as it always does. Mark returned to work, and the dog waited at home, watching through the window until he returned. Each reunion was quiet but meaningful. No jumping. No noise. Just shared presence. The unbelievable discovery had changed both of them. For Mark, it was a reminder that duty sometimes appears in unexpected forms. For the dog, it was the end of a long watch and the beginning of rest. Some stories end with noise and celebration. This one ended with peace. A loyal dog no longer alone. A man who listened when it mattered. And a bond built not on words, but on trust, patience, and the courage to follow when something silent asks to be seen.